Over the past few years, several old interviews with a Russian defector have come to prominence. Yuri Bezmenov, who defected from the Soviet Union in 1970, detailed in a set of talks from the 1980s how America had been infiltrated by communists with the aim of being completely subverted and destroyed. His disturbing warnings, made roughly 40 years ago, predicted the ideological defeat of America within a few decades. As many have noted, he doesn't seem to have been far off the mark. How did this come about? And is such subversion leading to the imminent destruction of America and indeed the West? Let us go back a century to consider the rise of several prominent intellectuals who may offer keys to the subversion of American culture. As Bezmenov has described, many subversive tactics had come out of the Soviet Union. But as time went on, such things would spread like a virus, no longer relying on the Soviets but operating independently within a new host nation. 19th and early 20th century revolutionary theorists, most prominently the Marxists, believed that violent revolution could be achieved through the rallying of the working class and the peasants. These people, as Marx wrote, could unite and throw off the chains of capitalism. Marx claimed that capitalist systems would inevitably collapse under their own weight and that socialism would be inevitable. Most theorists predicted that what was necessary to start this chain reaction was revolution. In 1917, a communist revolution did occur in Russia. However, it did not ignite a global workers' revolt. What's more, it happened in a feudal country, not a capitalist state. The Marxist theory had missed the mark on some basic assumptions. In the years following, two theorists would rise to prominence: Antonio Gramsci and Georgy Lukács. Lukács was considered the greatest socialist theorist since Karl Marx. His ideas were influential in most Marxist circles at the time, and as such, he was held as one who could pave the way forward for the ideology. At the core of his thinking remained the basic objectives of eliminating the family, religion, and private property, all seen as obstacles to the Marxist ideology. He did, however, offer some variations of Marxist and revolutionary utopian thought. Another communist political activist, Wilhelm Münzenberg, along with Lukács, explained that the working class were too accustomed to capitalism. Life in the West, their thinking goes, was too good, and people were too successful to feel the need to revolt. Only the rot and destruction of the culture that supported capitalism could lead to Marxism. As Lukács put it, who will save us from Western civilization? Münzenberg was also quoted as saying that we must organize the intellectuals and use them to make Western civilization stink. Only then, after they have corrupted all its values and made life impossible, can we impose the dictatorship of the proletariat. During these early days of the 20th century, some intellectuals in America were warming to the Marxist model. This was due partly to the effects of earlier socialist groups, such as the English Fabian socialists. However, the Russian Revolution appears to have been the primary factor. For example, prominent American philanthropist John Dewey admired the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, particularly the centralized, state-controlled schooling and educational system they had established. Dewey himself said that the revolution had a release of human powers on such an unprecedented scale that it is of incalculable significance, not only for that country, but for the world. Dewey would become highly influential in shaping the modern Western schooling system, which he claimed needed to experience something akin to a Russian revolution. He believed that schools needed to be guided under the centralized control of the state, which would direct how individuals could think. In his writings, Dewey makes it clear that he, as with most Marxists, stands in opposition to private property, religion, and the family. In fact, he was outwardly hostile to such things, which he perceived as a threat to collectivism. As he put it, during the transitional regime, the school cannot count upon the larger education to create in any single and wholehearted way the required collective and cooperative mentality, the traditional customs and institutions of the peasant. His small tracts, his three-system farming, the influence of home and church, all work automatically to create in him an individualistic ideology. Despite the greater inclination of the city worker towards collectivism, even his social environment works adversely in many respects. Hence, the great task of the school is to counteract and transform those domestic and neighborhood tendencies that are still so strong, even in a nominally collectivistic regime. It seems obvious that powerful intellectuals like Dewey, inspired by the Russian Revolution, would have collectivism over their current system. By 1919, Lukács would be appointed Deputy Commissar for Culture in Hungary. The communist government in power was led by Béla Kun, who had been planted in the country by Lenin following the Russian Revolution. Lukács' first act as a deputy commissar was to begin what he called cultural terrorism. This would be one of the first experiments testing a new form of cultural manipulation to bring about revolution. He rolled out a radical sex education program aimed at destroying the family. This program had far-reaching effects in Hungarian society, which had been relatively conservative. In a matter of months, the Hungarian socialist government was overthrown. It would not be an exaggeration to say that outrage amongst the people primarily stemmed from Lukács' attempt to destroy Hungarian culture.
He tried to actually undermine the unity of the family, and that was one of the reasons that he tried to introduce sex education. It's always much tougher to convert an adult, to do something what he was taught not to do. The only thing what we were permitted to accept as far as culture is concerned, what they were teaching, that was it. Free thinking was a very big sin.
In 1922, there would come a pivotal point for Marxism, when Lenin would organize several top Marxist intellectuals to theorize on why class consciousness wasn't working and how better to overthrow capitalism. Lukács and Münzenberg were among the intellectuals meeting over these issues, which inspired the formulation of a new Marxism, more capable of overthrowing what had been a rather successful capitalism. At this point, communist organizations in America were relatively small yet surprisingly organized. America was technically at war with the Bolsheviks, having aided White Russian forces in the Russian Civil War. Nevertheless, domestic communist groups were steadily on the rise. In 1922, their activities soon came to the attention of law enforcement. Police raided a meeting of top communists in Bridgman. Many secret documents were seized. One of the most surprising was a directive containing the signatures of several members of the Executive Committee of the Communist International. The document stated that the American Communist parties were indeed under the direction of the Communist International. Another letter was found, this one from the American Communists, detailing how members must penetrate all working class and semi-working class organizations, such that they function as tools and auxiliaries of the party. The directive from the International noted that in the future, when possible, the Communist parties should engage in real politics as registered political parties. The official American party had only been in operation since 1919. In the meantime, the true party will remain underground, giving the illusion that communist movements exist but are small unorganized fringe groups. The following year, in 1923, a research institute would be established for this exact purpose. Formed by Felix Weil, student of Karl Korsch, the newly established institute sought to bring together Marxist intellectuals to discuss how to advance the revolution with new methods. Initially planning to name it the Institute for Marxist Research, Weil more cautiously gave it the vague title of Institute for Social Research and would be opened in 1924. Today it is known as the Frankfurt School. Lukács' influence during the formative days of the Frankfurt School was significant. His clear message was to move Marxism away from economics and focus on culture. This sentiment was echoed by fellow Italian Marxist intellectual Antonio Gramsci. He believed that in the 20th century, Marxism could only succeed if it first infiltrated the cultural institutions, schools, universities, the media, the state apparatus. The first head of the Frankfurt School was Karl Grunberg. At the opening of the school, he was claimed to have said, "I too am one of the opponents of the economic, social and legal order which has been handed down to us by history, and I too am one of the supporters of Marxism. The Institute's ideology would be fleshed out some years later, when Grunberg was replaced by the rising Marxist intellectual Max Horkheimer. Horkheimer, inspired by Lukács, worked to pivot the Institute toward culture rather than economics, while separating the Institute from the tainted image of Soviet Marxism. He would lay the groundwork for what would become known as critical theory. The foundation of Horkheimer's new theory was the idea that economic disparity and oppression were not the primary issue, as Marx had thought. Rather, oppression was manifest in a variety of areas in Western society, be it sexual, religious, or other cultural norms. This theory was developed largely because Western working-class people lived good lives and apparently were blind to their slavery, and their happiness was merely an illusion. Thus, critical theory, as the name suggests, was to criticize the existing society, to find supposed weak points and expose their contradictions through a Marxist lens. Horkheimer's theory suggested that there were two types of revolution: the political revolution and the cultural revolution. A political revolution could see the overthrow of a government and economic system but would not address the old culture. A cultural revolution, however, could see everything overthrown, including every remnant of the previous society and culture. Horkheimer had said that logic is not independent of content. By this he meant that arguments are only logical if the content is about destroying Western culture, and illogical if it doesn't. This sort of thinking set the critical theorists apart from the old Marxists, often referred to as the classical or vulgar Marxists. Unlike the classical Marxists, whose primary concern beyond the proletariat revolution was the future of humanity, the critical theorists almost completely ignored discussion regarding the future. They became, it seems, profoundly nihilistic. By the 1930s, the Frankfurt School was under threat. The National Socialists took hold of power in Germany and threatened to shut down all communist threats. At this same time, two new members to the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno and Erich Fromm, were tasked with finding a safe haven for the Institute. Fromm succeeded in finding help in New York, largely thanks to support offered by the then president of Columbia University, and in 1935, the Frankfurt School was relocated to New York City. Before the move to America, the Institute had largely been focused on criticizing European culture. Now established in New York, the Institute would apply their critical theory to their new home, America. Communism had a strong foothold in America at this time, although not as entrenched as in Europe and with a different approach. From an outsider's perspective, there was the impression of a fragmented socialist and Marxist movement in America, with disunity among the many parties. This, however, was just an illusion of weakness and incoherence, as most of these seemingly diverse parties had common managers, directing them fundamentally in the same direction. This proved highly effective in both entrenching communist ideas in America, as well as avoiding unwanted scrutiny from the government. As Bezmenov notes, these groups initially had ties to Moscow or the Communist International, but as time went on, they became more autonomous in their revolutionary aspirations. From their base in New York, the critical theorists would analyze the situation in Europe, concluding that Karl Marx was wrong in his assumption that capitalism would inevitably collapse and give way to socialism. The new theory was that capitalism would become fascism, unless redirected through revolution to socialism. Thus, anyone who wished to uphold the existing culture or simply did not wish to align themselves with the socialist revolutionaries were labeled fascists, or at the very least enablers of fascism, an insult which continues to this day. Many of these concepts were published in The Authoritarian Personality in 1950, written by Theodor Adorno and fellow researchers at University of California, Berkeley. Adorno and his co-authors diagnose authoritarianism as a personality type identified by 9 traits on what they called a F-scale or fascist scale. As it so happened, the traits of the authoritarian personality described someone who would reject the tenets of critical theory. Those who held to more conservative values and rejected progressive concepts, for example, would likely be considered, or border on, an authoritarian personality type. With little respect for the culture of their new home in United States, Adorno and company attacked Americans, insinuating that so-called fascist traits were deeply rooted in the American people. Americans who sought to preserve their values were seen as unhinged, authoritarian, or worse. Before America entered the war with Germany, Max Horkheimer had already begun writing up proposals for the re-education or mental transformation of the German people. At the same time, a new member of the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse, was making a name for himself by working on similar theories. Fortunately for these critical theorists, many within positions of power held similar ideas, ushering the likes of Horkheimer and Marcuse into places of significant influence. By 1942, Marcuse was employed by the US Navy's Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, thanks to friends in high places, even though Marcuse was under close surveillance by the FBI, who rightly suspected him to be a communist infiltrator. Nevertheless, thanks to his powerful friends and careful use of rhetoric, Marcuse and his colleagues continued their work unhindered. Because of collaboration with the Soviets, American communists were now viewed as patriots. In fact, top-down coercion prevented serious investigations into communist manipulation during this period. President Roosevelt himself gave orders to the Civil Service Commission, restricting them from questioning whether members of the Federal Service were communists or not. Taking note of the subversion occurring during this period was Robert Morris, who headed a counterintelligence unit of the 3rd Naval District in Washington. He notes a pivotal point when President Roosevelt ordered the Navy to allow communists into the service, specifically with clearance to work as radar operators with access to classified information. Morris then received information from a communist defector, Viktor Kravchenko, who said this intelligence, which was intended to help Soviets fight Germans, was actually being catalogued for a future war with America. Morris took this information to his superiors, and for his efforts he was removed from intelligence and sent to the Pacific.
The National Maritime Union was then under control of the communists, it's not now, and they were putting their operatives on ships, and they had a network of intelligence.
After describing how President Roosevelt had ordered the Navy to allow Communist Party members to serve as radio operators with access to secret military communiques, Mr. Morris then turned to the subject of Soviet defector Viktor Kravchenko.
So we had to meet him clandestinely, and he was with the Soviet Purchasing Commission. And he had with him evidence, substantial evidence, that the Soviets were using the material, the naval material that we were sending to them to fight for Germans. They were not using it for that purpose, but instead they were using it to build up a large navy in the post-war period to take on the British and the Americans. And I had extensive evidence of that.
The head of the OSS during World War II was William Donovan. During this period, Donovan is known to have been in contact with Eugene Dennis, a Communist Party functionary, and used this connection to employ officers directly from the Communist Party. The bias at the OSS became immediately obvious. In German-occupied Yugoslavia, OSS funding and support was restricted from going to the nationalists who were fighting the Germans, namely the Chetniks under Draza Mihailovic. They would receive no help. Rather, funding would flow directly to the communists, led by Joseph Tito. After the war, Axis prisoners and others who did not wish to live under communism attempted to surrender to the Americans and the Chetniks. But orders from on high had all such people handed over to the Tito's communists or the Red Army, thus ensuring an Eastern European communist stronghold. Today this is known as Operation Keelhaul. Over 2 million people were forcibly repatriated to the communists, including those who had lived in America and England from before the Russian Revolution, 30 years earlier. The majority were civilians with families. Alexander Solzhenitsyn recalls that mass suicides were common amongst these families. Those that went to the Soviets were sent to gulags, as were most Soviet troops who had been further westward than Berlin during the war, whilst those who were handed over to Tito's communists were brutally mass executed. American soldiers would be used to round up and hand over these anti-communists. They were not in Soviet-controlled territory but lived throughout Europe. and their expulsion essentially destroyed any anti-communist movements emerging in Europe after the war. This inexcusable bias was noted by the FBI, who approached General Donovan and asked him if he knew that there were communists within the OSS. He replied, "Of course I know. That's why I hired them." Otto Otepka, a veteran internal security specialist, notes that during this time Roosevelt had offered the Soviets an opportunity to set up an NKVD office in Washington.
Roosevelt issued an order to the Civil Service Commission that investigators were forbidden to ask any questions concerning the communist backgrounds or communist affiliations of any applicant for the federal service.
Otto Otepka, for 36 years, was an internal security specialist for the federal government. In 1953, he became chief security evaluator for the State Department.
This included, of course, people in such key components of the government as the Office of Strategic Services. One of the most ridiculous things I ever heard of as a part of the relaxation of the security procedures then in effect by the Roosevelt administration was an attempt by the president to allow the Soviet Union to have an NKVD office in Washington, D.C., while in reciprocity, the United States would be allowed to have a branch of the OSS in Moscow. Now, when one knowledgeable studies the composition of the OSS from its inception, who would be ahead in that situation? Obviously, the Soviet Union.
Why is that?
Well, because of the OSS, as history has now established, was comprised at the very top in key positions with individuals who were sympathetic to the Soviet Union.
This was the perfect situation for a communist incursion into the state's institutions. By the late 1940s, it could be fair to say that the highest echelons had been infiltrated and, in some cases, resulting in startling breaches of national security. With the defeat of Germany looking inevitable, Marcuse was joined at the OSS by two other critical theorists, Otto Kirchheimer and Franz Neumann. At the same time, Horkheimer and Adorno had also been offered influential positions, giving Horkheimer a strategic platform as director of the scientific division of the American Jewish Committee for his radical ideas on the authoritarian personality. Horkheimer and the theorists in the OSS would together plan what would become known as the Denazification process. This process would offer the critical theorists a chance to spread their ideology across a huge part of Europe and later America. The organization created in 1944 for the task of denazification was the Institute on Re-Education of the Axis countries formed in New York, later to become part of a U.S. Committee on Educational Reconstruction. A mass censorship campaign was undertaken across Germany with over 30,000 books banned, all copies destroyed. Possession of such books was an offense. Thousands of book dealers were banned. Hundreds of cinemas, publishers, theaters and magazines were also forcibly shut down. These early actions of the denazification process was practically no different to the heavy-handed censorship policies employed by the Germans during the war. However, it was the next stage of the denazification process that would offer an open door for communism to truly infiltrate Europe and America. Using the theory of authoritarian personality type, a campaign was run to impose collective guilt upon the German people. A collective guilt embracing all Germans, not just those who willingly worked for the Nazis. This was explicitly noted by Sidney Bernstein, head of the Psychological Warfare Division, who was quoted as saying that the goal of the re-education program in Europe was to shake and humiliate the Germans and prove to them beyond any possible challenge that these German crimes against humanity were committed, and that the German people, not just the Nazis and the SS, bore responsibility. This was contrary to what one would likely consider the proper way to go about re-education, by educating the German people on the inhumane outcome of the Nazi ideology. Rather, it seemed the goal for the critical theorists was to attempt to force the Germans to renounce their culture entirely, a critical step toward a Marxist revolution. If this was the motivation for the critical theorists, then the Denazification process was opportunity to destroy a culture for Marxian purposes. But it was not to stop with Germany. As former Marxist turned anti-Marxist Paul A. Gottfried remarks, the re-education process, which included criticism of one's own culture, would expand outwards from Germany. It would implicate all European culture and eventually even American culture, until finally all forms of Western capitalist culture was diagnosed as fascist or fascist enabling. After the war, the doors were largely left open for high-level manipulation in America. As Bezmenov himself notes, the demoralization process against America required action from within, and once this had gained a certain momentum, American demoralization would be spontaneous, requiring no further guidance from Moscow. Communist incursions into the fabric of America had been happening since at least the 1920s, epitomized by the New York Times columnist Walter Duranty, who was on Joseph Stalin's payroll and obviously ideologically aligned with the Soviets. During the 1933 Ukrainian famine, or Holodomor, Soviet authorities locked down the region in an all-out effort toward collectivization and to prevent information from leaving the country. Rumors, however, did escape, and these rumors found their way to the capitalist West. In response, Duranty famously wrote an article claiming that there was no famine in Ukraine and that the Ukrainian citizens were, as he put it, hungry, not starving, when in fact many millions were dying of starvation. Two individuals, a communist turned anti-communist by the name of Malcolm Muggeridge and journalist Gareth Jones, both snuck into Ukraine to expose what was really going on. However, ideologues within the Western media apparatus prevented these ugly truths from going mainstream, defaulting rather to Duranty and his claims. Duranty would receive a Pulitzer Prize for his so-called journalism, which has never been revoked. This exemplifies a general trend in the 1930s, in which Marxist ideas, not yet tainted by the truth of the Soviet experiment, grew in popularity and increasingly so toward the end of the war.
I was one of the editors of the Student Review, which was a more or less communist-controlled student paper, and Edmund Stevens.
Nathaniel Weil joined the Communist Party at Harvard in 1932 after becoming convinced that capitalism was doomed and that the only other alternatives were communism or fascism. Shortly afterward, he obtained employment under the Roosevelt administration in the Department of Agriculture.
After I had been at the job for about a year, when I was 23, I received a telephone call from a voice which simply identified itself as Hal from New York. And Hal asked me to meet him at a restaurant in a part of town which government officials did not frequent. I inferred, of course, that Hal represented the Communist Party. And he told me that his name was Hal Ware. He said the decision has been taken to organize a special secret cell of communists who will be totally separated from the party and will include only those people who are believed to have a big future in the government of the United States. This unit will be under the direct control of the Communist International, and you will have nothing to do with the Communist Party or any member of it. We were under no circumstances to engage in communistic talk. We were not to indoctrinate anybody, and we were not to try to recruit anybody.
An early public defector was Whittaker Chambers. He confessed that he had secretly been a communist member for over a decade, during which time he had worked as liaison between high-ranking members of the federal government, who were actually communists.
We're getting information from the Army, particularly the Air Corps, from the Treasury, from the State Department, from the OSS, from the CIAA.
Tell us some of your activities when you were a card-carrying member.
Well, I think they're the usual activities for a communist member, participating in picket lines.
In November of 1945, Elizabeth Bentley revealed to the FBI that for 11 years she had served as an espionage courier between an agent from the Soviet Union and members of the American Underground Organization, most of whom held key positions within the United States government. When she was assigned this position, she was told to destroy her party card and any other documentation that might prove she was a member of the party. In her book entitled Out of Bondage, she describes the instructions of the Soviet agent. He said, "You are now no longer an ordinary communist, but a member of the underground. You must cut yourself off completely from all your old communist friends. You cannot even be known as a liberal and move in progressive circles. Instead, you must pose as an ultra-conservative with a slight leaning toward fascism."
Both Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley testified that 4 communist cells existed in positions of power. The first was the Ware Cell, run by Harold Ware of the Department of Agriculture. The second was the Silvermaster Cell, run by Nathan Gregory Silvermaster from the Farm Security Administration. The third was the Perlo Cell, run by Victor Perlo of the Treasury Department. Bentley and Chambers would implicate over 80 high-ranking personnel that they knew of. This included Roosevelt's economic advisor Lachlan Curry, economist for the Treasury Harold Glasser, and Assistant Secretary to the Treasury Harry Dexter White. White was one of the chief architects of both the World Bank and the IMF, and would author the Morgenthau Plan, considered part of the Denazification Plan, which explicitly set out to destroy all German manufacturing ability after the war, including heavy industry. Herbert Hoover investigated the plan and calculated that it would kill 25 million Europeans after the war if enacted. Fortunately, it was rejected and replaced by the more moderate Marshall Plan. Despite these revelations, President Harry Truman did nothing to repeal the pro-communist stance taken by Roosevelt before him. The fourth cell was that of Alger Hiss. Initially a law clerk in the Supreme Court, he would then join the Department of Agriculture and finally the State Department, becoming Assistant Secretary of State. Here he exerted influence, becoming official advisor to Roosevelt during the Alta Conference, giving insight into how to reshape post-war Europe and China. After the war, he oversaw the writing of the United Nations Charter, acting as chairman and Secretary General during its founding meeting. It is worth noting that in the UN General Assembly after this time, the Soviets were given 3 votes in matters, while America only had 1 vote, and the Soviets would always be given charge of UN military operations. It is now obvious why this was the case. As early as 1939, Hiss had been named as a communist agent by both Chambers and the French intelligence service. However, this revelation was obviously ignored. He would be implicated a further 3 times. First by Elizabeth Bentley in 1945, then by a Soviet defector in 1946, and lastly by defected and former member of the Frankfurt School Hedda Massing in 1949. Only this last instance did anyone really pay attention. Even so, President Truman vehemently stood against any accusations, going so far as to forbid the executive branch of government from handing over personal records of employees.
In this cell, there was also Owen J. Lattimore. This I know from reports received in the Politburo and given to me officially as managing editor of the Daily Worker.
Ask them if they ever found in me anything except the highest adherence to duty and honor. Then the committee can judge and the public can judge whether to believe a self-discredited accuser whose names and aliases are as numerous and as casual as his accusations. The other side of this question is the reliability of the allegations before this committee, the undocumented statements of the man who now calls himself Whittaker Chambers.
I don't hate Mr. Hiss. We were close friends, but we are caught in the tragedy of history. Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting and I am fighting. I've testified against him with remorse and pity.
Alger Hiss was far from the most powerful member at this point. Elizabeth Bentley noted that when she was a member, she was aware that 2 other cells existed in Washington. These groups were so important that other members were not allowed to know of their identities. These groups were never exposed.
The answer to that is that I attended with Hiss probably, at a guess, 30 meetings of the cell. The cell never contained more than 8 or 10 members while I was in it. And I would also meet them at parties, so that I knew Hiss, even though I did not like him too well. I don't mean I disliked him. I mean he impressed me as a cold, calculating person who had a certain fanaticism about him, a lack of the human qualities that one likes. But I knew him well, so there was no problem in my mind as to identification.
You've been watching part 1 of How Communism Took Over America. Please subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for part 2.